before we start, I would encourage you to have a set of the sermon notes. If you don't already have them, just go to the link below. You'll be able to print a set of the sermon notes from that link. I also want to encourage you to have some communion elements. You want to have some bread or a cracker. You want to have some juice or wine. If you don't have juice or wine, probably anything to drink would work. But you'll want to have those communion elements because here in about 20 minutes, when we get to the end of the sermon, we'll move right into a time of communion. So if you need any of those things, I would encourage you to pause the video right now. Get whatever you need. Once everything is ready, then go ahead and resume the playback. So, one of the challenges that I think most preachers face on a regular basis is, what can I do to make this passage more interesting, more compelling? I can't obviously speak for all preachers. I can only speak for myself. But I find that particularly when I am preaching on some of the epistles in the New Testament, some of the letters from Paul or John or Peter or whoever, the epistles, I have to figure out a way, at least in my mind, to make this more compelling, more interesting to people. So there's that. Now, on the other hand, occasionally there are passages on which I preach that the passage in and of itself is so interesting that there's practically nothing I think that I could possibly do to make it even more interesting. If anything, the main thing that I have to do is make sure that somehow I don't make it less interesting. And I know some of you smart alecks out there are about to say, well, Pastor Kerry, you do that on a regular basis. Haha, you are hilarious. But this is one of those passages where it is incredibly wild. And when I think about all of the passages that I've preached on from the Bible over the course of my pastoral career, if I was going to make a list of the 10 wildest passages, this would be not only on the list, but this would have to be close to the top of the list. Now, before we jump into this wild passage, one of the things that I need to do is I need to tell you the backstory because it is incredibly important. Now, the title of the passage is Jacob and Rachel and, parenthetically, and Leah, a complicated love story. And I know that you've heard the name Jacob before. You've probably heard the names Rachel and Leah as well. But I know you've heard the name Jacob because Jacob was one of the great patriarchs of the Old Testament. There was Abraham, there was Isaac, and there was Jacob. But here's the thing. In theory, you should have never heard of Jacob, or at very least, Jacob should have been a footnote. In theory, we should be talking about Abraham and Isaac and Esau. Why, you ask? Well, the reason is because Esau was Isaac's firstborn son. Now, it just so happens that Esau and Jacob were twins, but Esau was born first. And because he was Isaac's firstborn son, that made a huge difference in that world thousands of years ago. In this day and age, when you have twins that are born, the firstborn son of those twins doesn't make any difference. In theory, regardless of which child is born at which point in the birth order, shouldn't make any difference. But for better or for worse, probably for worse, in biblical times, there were a lot of things that happened for the firstborn son that didn't happen for the rest of the children. One of the things that happened for the firstborn son is he received a double portion of the family inheritance. So let's say there were 5 sons. That meant that the firstborn son would get 2 portions of the inheritance, and the other 4 sons would get single portions of the inheritance. You're saying, well, that's not fair. Well, that's how it worked in biblical times. Maybe even more importantly, in biblical times, the family name was passed on through the firstborn son. Not only that, but there was also a spiritual inheritance that was considered outside of the name and the monetary inheritance, and that was passed on through the firstborn son as well. Now, the interesting thing is that Esau, it seems, when you read the stories in the Old Testament, in the book of Genesis, it seemed like he really didn't care at all about that stuff. And His younger brother Jacob, who was born just minutes after him, Jacob cared a lot. And you probably know the story of the time when Esau had been out hunting in the field, because Esau was a manly man. So he came in from hunting in the field. He was famished. Jacob, who was more of a homebody and apparently was a talented cook, Jacob had been cooking up some stew. Esau comes in and says, "That smells good. Give me some of that stew." And Jacob says, "I'll give you some of this stew, but you have to give me your portion of the inheritance." And in what was probably the worst negotiation in human history, Esau said, "That's fine, just give me some stew." And so think about what he just did in that moment. If there are just the two sons, he has gone from receiving that double portion of the inheritance to now Jacob is getting the entire inheritance for a bowl of stew. So now Jacob is going to get the entire inheritance. He's going to get the family name. But the thing that hadn't happened, the thing that was still going to be passed along to Esau as the firstborn son, was at very least he was going to receive the spiritual inheritance. And Jacob wanted that too. Now here's where things get even wilder. At this point, Jacob's mother helped him. Isaac's wife helped Jacob to go and to deceive their father Isaac on his deathbed. So Jacob goes in and pretends to be Esau. He goes in and says, "Hey Dad, it's not looking too good for you. Maybe you should go ahead and pass that spiritual inheritance along to me." And the funny thing is, Isaac was suspicious. And Isaac said, "You know, it's strange because you sound a lot like Jacob." He goes, "But you smell like Esau." And they had made sure that Jacob would smell like Esau. Long story. And then he reached out and he touched Jacob's arms. Now, Esau was a very hairy man, and so Jacob and his mom had put animal skins on Jacob's arms. I know, crazy story, but he said, "Well, you feel like Esau, you smell like Esau, even though you sound like Jacob, you must be Esau." Here's the family's spiritual inheritance as well. And after Esau finds out about this, Esau goes, "That's the last straw. I am going to kill Jacob." And so it was at that point that Jacob gets out of town. He goes on the run. And so Jacob has gone at this point to get away from his brother who wants to murder him, because now Jacob has taken everything from his brother. He's taken the monetary inheritance, the family name, and now the spiritual inheritance, and all of these things that in theory Esau should have had as the firstborn son. Now he's got none of them. He wants to kill Jacob. And so Jacob is now on the run. He ends up hiding out with his uncle Laban. So remember that. This is Jacob's uncle Laban, who lives in a distant land with whom we are going to find Jacob heading into this wild passage. So let's take a look at Genesis 29, verses 16 through 30. Now, Uncle Laban had two daughters. The name of the older was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel. Leah had weak eyes, but Rachel had a lovely figure and was beautiful. Jacob was in love with Rachel and said, "I'll work for you 7 years in return for your younger daughter Rachel." Laban said, "It's better that I give her to you than some other man. So, okay, stay here with me." So Jacob served 7 years to get Rachel, but they seemed like only a few days to him because of his love for her. Then Jacob said to Laban, "Give me my wife, my time is completed, I want to make love to her." So Laban brought together all the people of the place and gave a feast. But when the evening came, he took his daughter Leah and brought her to Jacob, and Jacob made love to her. When morning came, there was Leah. So Jacob said to Laban, "What is this you have done to me? I served you for Rachel, didn't I? Why have you deceived me?" Laban replied, "It's not our custom here to give the younger daughter in marriage before the older one. finish this daughter's bridal week, then we will give you the younger one also in return for another 7 years of work. And Jacob did so. He finished the week with Leah. Then Laban gave him his daughter Rachel to be his wife. Jacob made love to Rachel also, and his love for Rachel was greater than his love for Leah. And he worked for Laban another 7 years. May God bless the reading of the melodramatic word. So that is a wild passage, isn't it? And I know that as I was reading that passage to you, as you were reading along on your own sermon notes, you're thinking, how could that happen? So let's talk about all of the fascinating aspects of this passage. And then after we talk about this passage, then what I want to do is discuss 3 of the important lessons that I think this passage has for you and I as people of faith. So, the beginning of the passage, it tells us that when Jacob goes to live with Uncle Laban, he sees that Uncle Laban has 2 daughters. One is Leah, and the passage says that she has weak eyes. Now, if you're wondering what that means, if you're wondering if weak eyes is a euphemism for something, the fact is we just don't know exactly what was meant by that. There are different ways that that could be interpreted, but the bottom line is there's no consensus, there's no clear way to interpret that. And what is obviously meant is that it's supposed to be a contrast with her younger sister Rachel. It says Rachel has a lovely figure, she's beautiful. So Rachel is the one who has this radiant beauty about her, where Leah has weak eyes, whatever that means. The passage says Jacob falls head over heels in love with his cousin Rachel. Now, the passage doesn't tell us exactly how they were related. It doesn't tell us if Rachel was his first cousin or his second cousin. It doesn't tell us if Rachel was his third cousin 4 times removed. We just don't know. But she was his cousin. And again, these are biblical times. That sort of thing was not frowned upon in biblical times like it would be today. And so the next interesting thing, at least to me in this passage, is when Jacob says, I will work for you for free for the next 7 years. His uncle Laban gives a pretty lukewarm response. His uncle Laban says, so you're offering to work for me for free for the next 7 years just for the privilege of marrying my younger daughter? I don't know. He says, it's better that I give her to you, I guess, than some other man. So, okay, we'll go ahead and do that. And the passage then says that Jacob served 7 years to get Rachel. Now, keep in mind, they were not together during these 7 years. And it makes it very clear at the end of this that and again, we have to remind ourselves this was a very different culture thousands of years ago. They have probably been making goo-goo eyes across the fields at each other for 7 years, but they have never been together. And it says that they only seemed like a few days to our friend Jacob because of his love for Rachel. Isn't that beautiful? And so at the end of 7 years, Jacob goes to his uncle Laban and says, I cannot wait anymore. And so he says, I want you to allow me to marry my wife, have my wedding night. And so in that culture, thousands of years ago, they had their big wedding feast. Now, in that culture, the wedding feast was a big deal. I know that you probably think that wedding days and wedding receptions have gotten out of hand in the year 2026. If you think that what happens in the year 2026 has gotten out of hand, I'm telling you it has nothing on what wedding celebrations were like thousands of years ago, because we know that wedding celebrations thousands of years ago, that they would last 4 days, which meant the father of the bride had to provide food and wine for guests 4 days. Sometimes it would last up to a week. And so we don't know how many days this wedding celebration has gone on, but it has almost undoubtedly gone on 4 days. And then at the end, when Laban brings his daughter to Jacob for their honeymoon night, for their wedding night, instead of bringing Rachel, he brings Leah. Now, I know that this is the point in which you were thinking to yourself, how could Jacob not know that he was spending the night with Leah? I just want to remind you that in that culture, that the women were usually covered from head to toe on formal occasions like a wedding celebration. So there's that. I also want to remind you that this was before the days of electricity, and so there would have been no proper lighting after dark. So there's that. And then really the elephant in the room is the fact that Jacob has been at this wedding celebration now for probably a matter of days, that he has been drinking for a matter of days. So there's that. And these are all reasons why it seems plausible, as difficult as it might seem for us in the year 2026 to imagine this happening today. This is why it was probably plausible for this to have happened back in biblical times. He wakes up the next morning and he realizes that he has spent the night with Leah, and so he immediately goes to Laban and says, wait a minute, this is not what I signed up for. And Laban says, well, Jacob, here's the thing. In our culture, the oldest daughter has to get married first. That's what has to happen. So I'll make you a deal. Have your honeymoon week with Leah, and then at the end of the week, I'll let you be married to Rachel as well. And again, in our culture, that would never happen. At least I really hope that would never happen in our culture. But in that culture, in biblical times, a man was allowed to have multiple wives, and so that was a perfectly acceptable thing to happen in that culture. And Uncle Laban says, but you got to work for me for free for another 7 years. And Jacob agrees to it. And so it tells us at the very end of this passage that he works for another 7 years. He's married to both Leah and Rachel. But here's something that I find to be incredibly sad. It says that Jacob's love for Rachel was greater than his love for Leah. One thing I would say very quickly is spare a thought for Leah in this passage, because in this passage I feel like she is just kind of used as a pawn. And there's nothing that she has done wrong in this passage. One thing, if you know the rest of the story of Jacob and Rachel and Leah, is you know that later on there's going to be a lot more drama, unfortunately, in this story. But at this point, she's done nothing wrong, and I think that she is treated very unkindly in this passage. So spare a thought for Leah. But now, what I need to hurry and do, because we're getting very short on time, is I want to talk about 3 of the lessons that this passage has for us as people of faith. And the first lesson is this. As people of faith, we should be willing to persevere for the important things. As people of faith, we should be willing to persevere for the important things. So think about what Jacob had to do in order to be married to Rachel in this passage. He had to work for free for his uncle for 14 years. But he did it because that was how much he loved Rachel. And I just want you to think about the things that are important to you. Your children, your family, hopefully your church. There are probably other important causes. Whatever they may be, I hope that the lesson you take and that I take from Jacob in this passage is the willingness to persevere for the important things. That is the first lesson. The second lesson we should take away from the passage is this. As people of faith, we should keep our end of the bargain even if others don't. As people of faith, we should keep our end of the bargain even if others don't. One of the things that I appreciate about Jacob in this passage is the fact that even though it feels like Uncle Laban is taking advantage of him, that Jacob doesn't end up saying to Rachel, hey, let's get out of here. And the fact that he remains married to Leah and that he works for the next 7 years for his Uncle Laban. He keeps up his end of the bargain even though it feels like he has had his Uncle Laban taken advantage of him. And I believe that as people of faith, one of the things that sets us apart is our character. And Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount talks about Look, if someone compels you to go 1 mile, then go the second mile. If someone strikes you on one cheek, turn the other cheek as well. Jesus says if someone sues you to take your cloak, give them the tunic as well. The point that Jesus makes in the Sermon on the Mount is that we should be willing to go above and beyond. That we should be willing to keep our end of the bargain even if others don't. And that kind of leads into the third lesson we should take from this passage, which is this. As people of faith, we should remember that what goes around comes around. As people of faith, we should remember that what goes around comes around. Now, what I'm not saying here is that when someone does wrong by us, that we should do wrong in return. In fact, that is just the opposite of what I just finished saying with the second point. We should not do something in evil in return when someone has done evil to us. But at the same time, what we have to remember is that as we go through life, we are sowing seeds, and sometimes we reap the things that we have sown. And an example is Jacob. So Jacob, earlier in his life, he took advantage of his brother Esau when Esau was in a vulnerable moment. He deceived his father Isaac when Isaac was on his deathbed. In fact, do you know that the name Jacob literally means deceiver? Because for the first however many years of his life, Jacob, for all intents and purposes, was a scoundrel. It's interesting to me, though, that once he finally comes across something or someone, in the case of Rachel, that he seems to become a better person. But up to this point in his life, he had sown a lot of unfortunate seeds of deception, and now he is reaping the harvest as his uncle deceives him in return. And that's something that I think you and I need to think about as we go through life. What are the seeds that we are sowing? Last week, if you watched the sermon video, we talked about the parable of the sower. The question for us this week is, what are the seeds that we are sowing in the metaphorical sense? Are we sowing seeds of anger? Are we sowing seeds of divisiveness? Or are we sowing seeds of kindness? Are we sowing seeds of helpfulness? Hopefully we are sowing those good seeds, and hopefully we will receive a positive harvest at the end of all of this. Because what we see over and over and over in the Bible is that what goes around comes around. Again, not saying that we should return evil for evil, but we should expect that whatever seeds we sow, that's what we're going to harvest. What goes around comes around. And I would just point out that we talked in this passage about how we should be willing to sacrifice for the things that are important to us. Jacob sacrificed 14 years of his life to be married to Rachel, and we know that Jesus made the ultimate sacrifice at the cross. The video is about to cut me off, but I would invite you to go ahead and partake of your communion elements after the video cuts me off. I'm going to grab my communion elements, and I'm going to invite you to partake at this time. The body of Christ broken for us, we partake in remembrance of him, and the blood of Christ